Is everybody doing? All right. Awesome. So first and foremost, let's talk business stuff. Well, let me pull up my teaching notes first. All right. First business thing, papers. When are they due?
29th.
The 29th?
Yeah, the 20, October 29th. When is that?
Thursday.
Yeah, not this upcoming Thursday, next Thursday.
Next Thursday.
Next Thursday. So I just need them on the Blackboard. If the Blackboard isn't working, then send it to my email, but the Blackboard should be working. Just make sure it's posted by October 29th, end of day. If you end up running a little over and it's a couple hours late, I won't take off. If you know that something's coming up, or if something does come up and you need an extension, get in touch with me. We'll work something out. All right. I am willing to read over drafts of papers. So if somebody wants to send me a draft and get some feedback on the draft before it's due, I'm happy to read it over, give comments, and then you can respond to it. However, because I need to have time to give you the comments and then get them back to you so you can respond to them, when do I need the drafts by? October 26th at 8 a.m. Thank you, Kendra. Yes, October 26th at 8 a.m. That's a Monday. So a week from yesterday. If you want to send me a full draft, I will go over the full draft. If you just want to send me a paragraph, I'll send you a paragraph. If you would rather meet by Zoom and just talk about it, that's fine too. It's just that I need it by this time, and this is the time that I have because that's when I'm going to get up on Monday, download them all, and give you all your feedback comments. That's the main things on the papers from my end. Does anyone have any questions?
I have a question.
Yeah,
for the paper, can we use like secondary sources?
Absolutely. So
like
here's
other,
what I'm gonna
yeah. So like other article that support you like his or her claim.
100%. So here's what I'm going to say about the sources. This is a really good question. The answer is you are welcome to use whatever sources you want. However, if you do not want to use any outside sources, the prompts are designed such that you do not have to use any. So if you just want to use this, what I say in class and what the readings for class were, the prompts are designed that you should be able to write an A paper using just those. However, if you want to use outside sources, you are more than welcome to. Very often the best papers do use some outside sources. Now, if you're going to use outside sources, make sure to cite them. How do you have to cite them? I don't care. Well, as long as if it's a website, just include the link at the end. If you want to practice your Chicago footnote formatting, go ahead. But I'm not going to, if you have like a period and then a comma instead of a comma before the day, I don't care about that stuff. Just make sure that if the source seems cool, I can find it and read it up on my own. And also if the plagiarism police were to show up and be like, hey, where'd they get this? I could say this student got their sources here. That's all I care about on this stuff. Any other questions? But that was a great question, Mohammed. Any others?
You don't need like a bibliography or nothing like that?
As long as you have the website attached, I don't care about it. If at the like literally, here could be your bibliography. Bibliography. URL http:// blah, 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 blah. That's enough. As long as I can find it if I wanted to find it. Where'd my eraser go? I lost an eraser. Oh, there it is. All right. If you want, I mean, it's a good skill to practice because there are people who care about such things. So if you want to practice your Chicago footnote style, go ahead. I'm just not one of the people who cares, so I will never take off points for that.
Okay.
Yeah, so really, I want you all to learn and to put your thoughts into the ideas, not spend time fixating on whether the correct format is this or this. Like, come on, like who cares? Somebody cares, but it's not me. All right, any other questions on the paper? Yeah, Diego. Or was that an accidental bump?
Oh no, that's me saying I agree with you.
Okay, perfect.
Who cares?
Okay, yeah, sounds good. Yeah, there are people who really care about this stuff, but I'm not one of them.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. All right. So any other questions? Are we good? All right. Awesome. So these are this is drafts. And this is final. All right. Next thing of note. So today, getting back into the stuff, we have talked about the representational theory of mind for a very long time. And then I gave a little bonus lecture on Thursday about the language of thought. This is an honest, flat-footed, no judgment question. I'm literally just trying to judge how much review we need, because I'm basically going to take the language of thought stuff for granted in what we talk about in the second half of class. So therefore, I don't want to talk to people. I would much rather talk to people. If you haven't watched the video, I want to know, not because I'm judging you or care, but because I don't want to assume a bunch of stuff that you don't actually understand, and I'm just talking past you and it's a waste of everyone's time. So how many of you actually managed to watch, and again, no judgment, it's a busy time of the semester. How many of you watched the language of thought video? Was there anyone who managed to do it? Otherwise, I will go over in a bit more detail. Raise your thumbs if you did succeed. If not, I'm going to assume none, and I'm going to go from there. All right, good. This makes me think that you're all college students who have lives. So good job. Nobody did watch the video. I can give it to people in future semesters. Watch it at some point because it is interesting and helpful. And if you're going to write a paper on language of thought later in the semester, it will be useful. But I'm not going to assume that anyone watched it. I will do a brief jump through of what on earth we're talking about so that in the second half of class, I can refer to it. So let me erase this stuff. So let's start off. RTM, representational theory of mind. This was the stuff that we've talked about for the past, I don't know, 4 weeks. And the key idea, rather than asking questions, I'm just going to breeze through this so we can get to the dual process stuff. Representational theory of mind says that inside the head, so if this is a head, there are mental symbols. So for instance, in your head, you've got this symbol. This symbol is going to designate something out in the world. So this symbol designates, say, I'm going to go with my example from a couple videos back, which is there's someone standing next to a church. This is a church. Bell, see, beautiful church, big door, windows. All right, so this is your thought. I believe that there's somebody standing next to a church. You've got a mental symbol that is in some sense about this thing out here in the world. So what is it to have the belief that someone's standing next to a church? Well, you just have the symbol that designates that, and you have this symbol in the believey sort of way. So that's all of this should sound familiar from the last few classes. This is kind of the assumption that everyone working in cognitive science, and these days most people working in psychology, accept that we have mental symbols, they designate things in the world. However, you can have questions that come up at this point. And one of the biggest questions is this. Which marker should I use? Let's use black. No, let's use blue. What are these symbols like? Basically, if we're saying that the world, or the way we think, is we have symbols that refer to things in the world, a question you might ask at this point is, what are these symbols like? Are they things that they're just entire units? So if you're going to model what thinking is like, and this is really asking this question of what are these symbols like is really a core question of basically, what is it to think? If I think that the sky is blue, therefore something is blue, that's a sort of thinking that anybody's capable of. We do it all the time. And the question is, if we're trying to understand how the mind works, how do we conceive of what's happening here? One thought is to think that we had one mental symbol in our head corresponding to that the sky is blue, or to use this particular case, this symbol corresponds to that somebody is standing next to a church. Or let's go with a better example. Let's go with, this person's name is now John. So this is the belief that John is standing next to the church. And then you have a separate belief, say square, And square corresponds to that somebody is standing next to the church. So if John's standing next to the church, you therefore can conclude there is somebody who's standing next to the church. The churchyard is not empty. So how would you diagram what it is to think? Well, on this view, it would just be thinking one symbol to another. What it is to think is just to have the thought content, John is standing next to the church, causing from there, it then somehow causes you to have the thought that somebody's standing next to the church. Now, that's one view. These are completed wholes. So what are these symbols like? They're answer one, indivisible wholes. And therefore what thinking is just transitions from these indivisible wholes. Now, based on the phrase language of thought, what does a language of thought theorist think? Do they think these are indivisible symbols? What it is to think a thought is to have some completed whole symbol in your head. I'll give you a clue. No. What does a language of thought theorist think the symbols in our head are like? Are they indivisible wholes or are they like something else? Give you a clue. It's in the name language of thought. Well, when we're talking about language, what are we usually talking about? If I say like right now I'm speaking a language, how would you describe what I'm producing?
You're producing words, like you're producing sounds that come out as words.
Words. And what do those words combine into?
A sentence.
Sentences. So the idea is that when I make here's a sound I can make. Bleh! Bleh! Does not have clear parts. Bleh! Is one loud sound. However, if I say a sentence like, hello, how are you today? We can break it down into hello, how are you today? 5 different parts. It's nicely cleaned up. Well, bleh is an indivisible whole. The sentence seems to have parts. A language of thought theorist is going to say that the symbols in our minds also have parts like that. So when I have a thought, John is standing next to the church, it's not that I have this entire thing equivalent to bleh and bleh corresponds to this. It's rather that in my head, my thought is comprised of smaller parts. And those smaller parts are almost like sentences in the head. So yeah, Kaylin, sorry, I didn't see this, but yes, word sentences. You were correct as well. So the idea is that in my head are not, this is an accurate picture of what's going on. What actually is in my head is something like this. I have a symbol that refers to, in my head, there's the John symbol, and there's the church symbol, and then there's the next to symbol. And it's not going to be, I'm just using letters because it's simpler this way, but you could think of it more like this. So it's not that in my head are, I should have made this in red, sorry. It's not that in my head is a completed sentence whole. It's rather that, I don't know why I chose H, but there we go. It's rather that each part of what I believe corresponds to something. So the triangle corresponds not to the whole thing, but just to John. And the circle, or the H, corresponds just to church. And then this little thing here, the relation of one being next to the other, that corresponds to the circle. So the idea is that your thoughts aren't just complete wholes. It's rather they are made up of parts. So yeah, the idea, Kaylin's right, is that each individual part is an independent unit. So you have this symbol for church, and then the symbols themselves are independent, and they could then be rearranged. So if this is my thought that John is standing next to a church, we could have a different thought, which would be that John is standing next to, say, the Empire State Building. So how would you put out that thought? Well, it wouldn't be a full new symbol. It would instead look something like this. So this would be what it is to think that John is standing next to the Empire State Building. Let's say the Empire State Building symbol looks like that. So this is the thought he's standing next to a church. This is the thought he's standing next to the Empire State Building. And so the idea is that our thoughts are built out of building blocks that get combined together in accordance with rules in much the same way that sentences do. So it's not just that you have a complete thought. So it's not like I have a thing, like I could say I have the thought that John is standing next to the church, or I have the thought that bunnies are cute. But it's more accurate to say that I have a thought that of the entire unit, which is made up of smaller parts. So it's not that I have the thought, indivisible whole, bunnies are cute. It's rather I have a thought, and that thought is combined of smaller symbols. I have the symbol for bunny, the symbol for cute, the symbol for having the property of, or something like that. So this is the idea of the language of thought, that in your head are sentences. Now, the obvious question at this point is, why should I give a damn about this? What is the point of trying to understand what's happening here? Well, here's a few different answers to this. I'm going to erase this just because it looks like crap. But here's the basic idea. Why should I care whether there are sentences in thought or whether it's full indivisible wholes? Well, here's the first reason. Why are you taking a psychology class? What is the point of taking a psychology class? Well, if you're taking a psychology class, you've already accepted that the mind is something that's interesting, and understanding how it works is worthy of study. So there's a sense in which, why should I care of lot versus not lot? Well, if you accept that the mind is interesting and worth studying, then what you're asking about with language of thought versus not language of thought is this is ultimately a question of how does thinking work? Because if you say that the mind is made up of indivisible symbols equivalent of bleh, then all you can say thinking is transitioning from one completed representation to another completed representation. So if you wanted to draw a symbol of a transition from the sky is blue to something is blue, then what you're going to draw is these are entire units that have no parts. They can't be combined to each other. So what thinking is, if you don't accept the language of thought, is transitions from one complete mental state to another. That's what thinking is to have one thought and then have another one that are themselves connected to things in the world, but there's no similarities between these. If, however, you say that the language of thought is how thinking works, then what thinking looks like, and I'm going to use some logical symbols where if they don't make sense to you, that's fine. This is what it would look like if you accept the language of thought. Then the thought from John is standing next to the church. You say church, John, let's see. So it'd be next to relation, church, John, transition.
Professor?
Yeah?
Your screen is blurry.
Oh, God damn it. Let's try the dancing approach again. Is it working? Did it come back?
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Dancing always works. Okay, so I just have to stay here. Then the transition would be from this to there is something X. So I'm putting this in logical form for those of you who know what I'm talking about. But if you don't know this, it's not important. There's something X such that church next to X. So even if you don't understand the logical symbols, you can see that in this case, there's nothing in common between these two. Well, in this case, actually, this should be in green. There is something X such that C and X. So what can you say in this case that you can't say in this case? There's going to be things in this latter case that are the same in both sides. So, for instance, what's the same over here and over here? There are certain symbols that are going to be the same.
N.
Yeah, N is in both of them. What's the other symbol that's the same in both?
E.
C. So C is the same in both of them. So if you accept the language of thought, then what you're saying is thinking involves moving of parts of thoughts. Parts of thoughts can be moved around. And to think is to combine parts of your thoughts together in new ways. If you don't accept the language of thought, you have to say that all thinking is transitioning from one completed representational state to another. So if you're going to actually draw what it is to think something, it's just going to be from whole state to whole state. You can't do it in this sort of algorithmic, computerized way. So another way of thinking about language of thought is if you accept the language of thought, you think that thinking is fundamentally the same as designing a computer language in which individual symbols correspond to certain meanings and get moved around and calculated. If you say instead that there are no thoughts, there's no contents, this is to say that the way you think about thinking is in terms of, well, the best way that it's been modeled is connectionist systems, which I'm not going to go into here, but it's basically to understand how thinking works. You're talking about the whole mind at once and talking about whole states. So it's basically, why should you care about lot versus not lot? Well, it totally, whether you accept it or not, entirely affects how you think thinking works. And if you've already accepted that psychology is worthy of your time, then you also have to accept that this is a worthy question, because this question is essentially, what is it to think? How should we think of thinking? Should we think of our thoughts as made up of smaller units that get combined together? Or should we think of our thoughts as full transitions from one completed brain state or completed mental state to another? And so that's what it comes down to at the end of the day. So that's the background of language of thought. Is to accept language of thought is to accept that the brain is in even more ways than we talked about last time, like a computer. We run a mental, like instead of running Python or instead of running C++, we run mentalese, where mentalese is a set of symbols in a language, like in a whatever is understood by our unconscious and conscious processing. And so what it is to have a thought is to have these symbols in our heads be reorganized and lined up. And what the rules of thinking are telling you what are the correct sorts of transitions you can make. What is it to transition from, why is it okay to go from something's, John's next to the church to something's next to the church? Well, because we have a rule that allows us to go from an individual to a something. And so this is what it comes down to. Does this make sense to everyone of what the core idea is? To think that the mind operates in some type of language-like thing is to just say that thinking is essentially like running lines of code in a computer system. And if you don't accept that it's a running in this way, then the mind is not like a computer system. So so that's the background. Does this make sense? Just the general picture stuff. I'm going to talk now about why we should think this, or what Fodor thinks, why he thinks. So by believing the language of thought, we believe that one thought can impact another thought. So Alan, this is a really good question. So to be clear, so I'm going to label these. This is lot, and this is not lot. And I'll draw the line between the two. I should have put them farther apart, but that's the idea. So both the language of thought theorist and a non-language of thought theorist think that one thought can impact another thought. What they differ on is how that impact happens. If you're a language of thought theorist, you think that the impact can operate over parts of thoughts. You think that it makes sense to speak in terms of having a particular like individual thought part, like a part of your belief. You can say that you have something in your head that corresponds to churches, and you can then use that in other thoughts. While if you're not a language of thought theorist, you can have the thought that John is standing next to the church, and that could cause you to have the thought that John, or that someone's standing next to the church. But you can't say that the reason that you're able to go from one to the other is that they contain the same parts, because there are no parts if you're not a language of thought theorist. So in both cases, thinking is a matter of one mental state causing another. It's just you define what the contents are in a language of thought case in a more fine-grained way. So one thing that makes sense is if you're a language of thought theorist, you can start to ask questions about the parts of thought in a way that you can't if you're not a language of thought theorist. So to take a more practical case, if you're like a therapist, to go to a more concrete psychology case, if you're a therapist and you're trying to get somebody to have say you're working with somebody who's got terribly low self-esteem and they just hate themselves and they think they're the stupidest person ever. So they used to have this thought, like you can imagine just substituting out, this is, I'm terrible. And you're trying to transition them into the thought, I'm not terrible. Well, if you're not a language of thought theorist, the way you transition is you replace one entire thought content with another. If you are a language of thought theorist, then it seems what you're doing is you're substituting something is terrible. No, I should use a different color. Let's use red. No, terrible me. And you're trying to turn this into a different thought, namely, not terrible me. So if you're trying to figure out how to change someone's mind, if understanding what the content is like is going to play a role. If you're saying that this one, it contains the thought, terrible me, and then you're saying not terrible me, it's a different sort of thing than this one. And you might be able to gain some insights into how do you go about changing minds, where the nature of the content, one thing that's true about human beings is it's very difficult to get us to, so here's a fact. If you tell somebody, think about how you're terrible, but now think you're not terrible, that's actually a really bad way of getting people to change their self-esteem. And one of the ways you can understand why this is so bad and why it won't work, according to a language of thought theorist, is that part of what it takes to think that you're not terrible is to first think about the content you are terrible. So because what you're doing is you're taking the concept you are terrible and then applying not to it. And so in the process of doing that, you first have to think you're terrible. And so it's very, very difficult. One of the things about low self-esteem is it's incredibly hard to raise people's self-esteem. And telling someone you're not terrible never seems to work. And so this is a practical case in which how you think about thinking is going to change how you go about changing low self-esteem. If you accept the language of thought, then you're going to recognize that telling someone you're not terrible is not going to be a very effective way. If, however, the language of thought is wrong, and these aren't in any way sharing parts, then telling somebody over and over again, you're not terrible, you're not terrible, you're not terrible, should solve their self-esteem problem. So does this make sense about how this actually has a practical difference? How you think about the contents of mind and how we work on them, and the exact method is much more than just an interesting sort of language of thought versus not language of thought thinking is interesting to talk about. It's also how you go about fixing people's mental issues or how you go about teaching someone new things is going to be a fundamentally different idea on the two conceptions of what thinking is. Does that make sense to people about how this, like, something as simple as the language of thought versus not is really why this is like a core idea about how the human mind works that has many implications in psychology beyond just a theoretical philosophical approach. How you go about teaching people new things is going to depend on how you think they think and how you go about helping someone. If you're a psychology major because you want to go into like clinical therapy and help people out in the real world, knowing how the mind works and getting clear about how thinking works and how the processes are crucial for knowing how to help people think better or stop having destructive thoughts. So this was my little spiel about why language of thought does matter. Does this make sense? Let me pause here. All right. Any questions at this point? Looking at the chat, anything else? All right. So then, why should you accept language of thought? Fodor gives 3 reasons. I'm just going to quickly mention one. If you want to know what the others are, go back and watch the video that was posted Thursday. If you haven't done so already, there are a few new people here who may have watched the video. But basically, the idea is this. Here are 2 different thoughts. Trump likes Trump. 30 Years War, there's number 1. Number 2, the 30 Years War began with a defenestration in Prague. All right, let me dance around because I feel like we just got blurry. All right, These are two thoughts. Thought number one, thought number two. How many people think they understand what number one means? Trump likes Trump. How many people think they understand this? Not a trick question, straightforward, literally. How many of you, is this true? Is it true that Trump likes Trump? Come on, give me something here, folks.
Yes.
Yeah, Trump likes himself. Yes, that is true. All right, is this true? Is it true that the 30 Years' War began with a defenestration in Prague? Does anyone, how many people know what this means or has any idea what I'm talking about here? Yeah, that's the correct answer, Eddie. So what I'm trying to show here is that when thoughts don't have any connection, there's no relation between Trump likes Trump and the 30 Years' War began with a defenestration in Prague. These are two different thought contents, and it seems like you can have one without the other. They're totally separate ideas, totally disconnected. As a matter of fact, well, first off, what's a defenestration? I'm now going to fill this out. Anyone know what a defenestration is? It means to throw someone out a window. So the question is, did the 30 Years' War begin with a defenestration in Prague? The answer is yes. There was an event called the Defenestration of Prague, in which a bunch of Protestants threw a Catholic out a window, and it started a 30 Years' War. So this is an actual fact. The person flew out the window and landed in a pile of poop. They survived. It started a war. Wars start for stupid reasons. But here's the thing of the 30 Years' War began with defenestration of Prague, and Trump likes Trump. It seems like these are totally unconnected. You can have one without the other. If you don't accept the language of thought, then everything is like this. Every thought is disconnected from every other thoughts. Because Trump starts Trump is one thing, and the 30 Years' War began, totally separate thing. But now let's add a third thought. Trump likes money. Trump likes money. Now, intuitively, it looks like 1 and 3. If you can understand 1, if you understand that Trump likes Trump and you know what that means, it seems like you can also, even if you disagree with it, you can understand what it means to say that Trump likes money. You would also understand what it means to say Trump likes Ivanka Trump, or you could understand what it means to say Trump likes the police. It seems like if you can think this one, then you can think any other one that seems similar to it intuitively. But if you deny language of thought, then there are no parts to thoughts, and every single content is an individual whole, which cannot be broken down. So if you say the language of thought, then you can easily explain why 1 and 3 seem similar, but 2 seems very different. What you can say is that because thoughts can contain parts, what you say is that 1 and 3 share parts. They share the Trump part and they share the liking part. And the reason that 2 seems very different is it doesn't share any parts. If you deny language of thought, though, you don't get to say that because thoughts don't have parts, so they can't share parts. Therefore, if you deny language of thought, what you say is that even things that look like they share parts, you have to explain them in some other way. And Fodor says that one of the fact that anything, you could plug in anything here after Trump likes, and you'd be able to understand it so long as you understand what Trump, the meaning of Trump and the meaning of likes. Anything that goes there anything that goes there, you can understand. Your thought is very systematic. However, if you deny language of thought, there can be no relations in this way because thoughts don't have parts. Does this general idea make sense? The argument goes like this. If you want to explain this, you have to say that there are parts. Language of thought says there are parts. Not language of thought says there are no parts. Therefore, language of thought is better. That's basically how the argument goes. All right, any other questions at this point? That's the background of, it took a little longer to review all that stuff. Yeah, so it would be very hard for so a behaviorist is somebody who would try to deny, I mean, they would be a few levels down of denying that the thought has parts, but one of the things that a behaviorist, one of the reasons people don't like behaviorism is that it seems like this fact here is something we want to account for, and a behaviorist doesn't even have the repertoire to even talk about minds in the first place. All right, I'm going to erase this now, and we're now going to jump into something. All right. So according to language of thought, all thinking is transitions from one sentence to another. And one thing we can ask at this point is, what are the rules of thought? And the answer the language of thought theorist generally gives is they're a lot like the rules of our logics. And this was something we talked about last time. And so the idea is that the way the mind is structured is that there are just certain rules built into our heads that transition us from one sentence to another. Like one mentalese content to another mentalese content. So why is it that this, like every one of us, I'm going to put something up on the board and you'll know immediately that it follows, right? Okay, so here we go. All emus have wings. All emus have wings. George is an emu. Therefore, George has wings. This is not in any way profound. This is straightforward. We all understand it straight away. And now, according to language of thought, the reason why we're all able to do this is built into our minds is a rule that allows us to go from a general statement, an all statement, combined with an instance of that all statement to George has wings. So what you could think of is you have like the way your thought would be structured would literally be something like all x, y allows you to say G is X, conclusion, you can draw G is Y. That's just anything that goes in there allows you to think in this way. That's how language of thought works. And it seems like it does a really good job of explaining how some of these things work and how the thinking goes. Now, here's the issue. It seems like there are a lot of cases in which our thinking, if language of thought is right, and we always think in a language of thought language of thought, our thoughts basically are transitions from premises to conclusions, just as in a critical thinking class or in a logic class. All it is to think, your premises are thoughts, your conclusions are other thoughts, and what thinking is treating certain thoughts as premises, other thoughts as conclusions, and you just move through in this logical way. And the idea is, this is why it's so easy for us to recognize that certain things are true. Like this is obviously true to us just because that's how the mind works. In a case of John is standing next to a church, therefore somebody's standing next to a church. Again, it's just built into our thought that if one particular example is something, then you know that there is something that's that something. That's just built into our mind and how we think. So the idea is, if you accept language of thought on this view, it's supposed to explain why our thought has these logical structures. So Ray has a great question, which is, animals who have no language can't think. So here's a question, here's an important thing to differentiate. So language versus a language. So when we're talking about a language, I mean something like Mandarin, English, Filipino, anything like that. That is what I'm talking about as a language. It's also going to include like C++, etc. When I mean language in general, in this context, it just means any type of symbol system. So when Fodor says that there's a language of thought, he's not saying that we think in something like English, or that even speaking English affects how we think. That's an idea we're going to talk about in a couple of weeks, this idea of Worfianism. So what Fodor's actually open to the idea that animals think in a language of thought. He actually does think that certain senses in which animals are combining symbols in much the same way we do. It's a simpler version. They don't have as many complex operations in their heads, but he actually thinks that if you have a language, many animals can have a language of thought. Now, on this view, if you found an animal that's so dumb it can't even be described in terms of mental symbols, then that thing is incapable of thinking. So for instance, a sponge is not going to be able to think. And by a sponge, I don't mean like the things, the like artificial ones you buy at the store. I mean the ones that live at the bottom of the ocean, have babies with themselves. The ones that like they used to use you can still buy them at certain stores. But yeah, so in this case, if you could find something that didn't have mental symbols and combine them in new ways, that would not be something that thinks in the way we do. But it's important to keep apart the idea of a language. So in response to Ray's question of an animal who has no language of thought or no mental combinatorial systems would be incapable of thinking, because on this view, by definition, to think is to move symbols around in this way. So this is the background of Fodor comes along and says it's really easy to explain human thought because thinking is symbol manipulation, and the rules of thinking are just very similar to the rules of logic, and they're built into our heads. All right, everyone on board thus far? Are we doing okay? All right, I'm now about to post something into the chat and also email it to those of you, to everyone. So you can either check in the chat or you can check your email. Let me first Control-C. All right, it is now sent by email and it is now about to be posted in the chat. Hopefully, hopefully it goes through okay. Control-V. Answer these questions. That's all I want you to do for 10 minutes. Answer these questions. These questions are designed to bring out the idea that one of the pressures on Fodor's idea of language of thought. And what this is supposed to show is if Fodor's right and we think in terms of logic, then when we should have no trouble doing logic in our actual lives. We should have no issues trying to do these things. And what some of these questions, these are pretty simple questions, just answer them quickly. It's going to take you 5 to 10 minutes. They're not designed to be especially tricky. Just answer them. I'm going to step off screen for about 2 minutes. I'll come back and answer the questions. But basically, go to this Google Docs link, which I just sent. Hopefully it opens right. Yes, it should work. All right. And once you've answered these questions, just hang out for a minute. I'll be right back, and then we will go over these questions and use them as a way of illustrating certain points. If your name, let's see who all is here. If your name is Tajaria, these might look familiar. Pretend you have never seen them before. And I think, is Rafal here? Okay. Rafal, if you're here, they also might look familiar. But just answer these questions, what I want you to do right now. All right, I'll be right back. All right, are people answering these? Is this happening? Let me check the answers. Google Forms. Responses. All right, come on. Chop, chop. One response. Yay. Why is this font so big? All right, I'm going to give everyone 3 more minutes. So hurry up. Chop, chop. Again, don't put too much thought into them. Just go quick. We're up to 8. So good. We have 8 people. Also, for the record, I'm looking at the answers and you are all giving me exactly what I was hoping for. So you're all giving me precisely, you're making all the right mistakes for me to illustrate my point. So good work, everyone. You are doing exactly what I hoped you would all do. 1 minute left. I'm sure that if somebody's watching this video because they're not here in class, this is going to be the most interesting watching ever. They're just going to be sitting here watching nothing happen for 10 minutes. People who are watching this, I hope you're fast forwarding. All right. 15 responses. 15 is a good number. 16 is a good number. All right. Okay. Am I still, is the volume still on? Yes. Okay. So let's just go through here. What was the point of this exercise? Why was I giving this to you? Any hypotheses as to what the point of asking these questions was? Any guesses?
Exposing us for being illogical.
Yeah. The point of this is that these questions are designed to show the ways in which human beings are illogical. Why? Because some of these questions are grouped into twos. Namely, that questions 1 and 2, 3 and 4, and 5 and 6 are structurally all identical. If we were to describe these questions in terms of logic and what's applying in each case, what we'd see is that the exact same principles are active in both. So let's go with number 2 first. Number 2 is the question of, if you had to bet your life on it, would you bet that if you flipped a coin, it would come up heads twice? Or would you bet that it's going to come up tails 10 times in a row? Or they're the same, you're screwed either way. If you had to bet, what's the smarter bet? 80% of you got it right. What's the correct bet? If you had to either guess it's going to come up tails 10 times in a row or heads twice in a row, what's more likely?
Heads twice.
Heads twice. Why? Why is it more likely? What is it about this? Because in a certain sense, in both cases, what's happening is they're both instances of all the same. In both cases, you've got all the same result, but one of them is the smarter one to bet on. Why? Why is it smarter to bet on 2 heads than 10 tails?
Higher probability.
Higher probability. And why? Why is there a higher probability? It's there in the words. Twice versus 10 times. 2 is smaller than 10. Simple as that. And in an extreme case like this, when you're asking all the same of anything is a rather rare occurrence in anything probabilistic. Like anytime it's random, the odds of getting all of the same result over and over again is smaller than 50% as soon as you have multiple trials. But why is it better in 2 than in 10? Well, because it's a smaller sample size. The odds of getting all the same is smaller, or is a higher percentage when you're doing it less times. An extreme case is more likely it's far more likely that you are going to accidentally, I'm not very good at shooting because I've never held a gun in my life. If I were to hold a gun and try to shoot at a target, it's more likely that I get lucky and get a single bullseye on my first try than it is that I'd hit the bullseye 100 straight times, never having held a gun. Why? Just because extreme things happen in small sample sizes. So and all of you intuitively understood this. Your thought was something along the lines of, well, if there's only 2, you calculated, it was pretty straightforward. And yet, what is the correct answer to number 1? Why is it that small counties in the Midwest, South, and West have the highest percentage of pancreatic cancer and also the lowest percentage of pancreatic cancer? What's the reason here?
It's more likely for a county to be that way, like the popular characteristic of the Republican sparsely populated.
So the key here is which word of all of them, which is the key word here? Of Republican, sparsely populated, rural, South, Midwest, or West. What's the key phrase to explain why these are the highest percentages? I'll give you a clue. It's exactly like this. It's the sparsely populated one. Why? Think of it this way. In New York City, what's the odd? Let's say the odds of a human being getting pancreatic cancer is say 1 in 100. That's an extremely high odds. That's not accurate. But imagine that 1 out of every 100 people gets it. So if you're in New York City with a population of 7 million, it would be 7 million divided by 100, and you'd end up with whatever that number is. That's on average. You're very unlikely to get an extreme case. But now imagine that you have a bunch of counties, each of which has 3 people in it. Most of these counties are going to, because it's very small, most of these counties are going to end up with 0 people with pancreatic cancer. If you're a county with 0 people with pancreatic cancer, what percentage of your population has pancreatic cancer? 0 divided by 3 equals what?
0.
0, yeah. So if you're a county with only 3 people, then odds are there's a pretty good chance nobody's going to have it, which means you're going to be at an extreme end. The counties that have no pancreatic cancer whatsoever are going to be rural. Why? Because just the way statistics work, if you only have 3 people in your county, odds are that you're going to not have any. And in that case, you're going to be at 0%, very low. The odds that no one in New York City has pancreatic cancer, that's not a very likely possibility because there's so many people in New York City that odds are somebody's got pancreatic cancer. And so long as somebody's got pancreatic cancer, you're going to be above the 0% mark. So the rarest, in a county in which there's not many people, you're going to end up with a very rare, like an extreme outcome of 0%. On the flip side, if you're a county that has 3 people and one of them has pancreatic cancer, what is your pancreatic cancer rate? %33%, yeah, 33%. So this county that has 3 people is also going to end up with an extraordinarily high pancreatic cancer rate. In both cases, it's got nothing to do with our brains, or nothing to do with like the water supply, the government, where they are, anything else. All it means is that if you've got a very small sample size, crazy shit happens. In the same way as with the coin flips. In the coin flip, the reason you knew that 2 was the better answer is because the 2 times is an instance of, intuitively somehow you were able to think, oh, okay, 80% of you knew that it's less likely to get 10 tails in a row than 2 heads, because you know that all the same is more likely to happen in a smaller sample size. However, you weren't, by and large, able to carry that same thought over to this case. Intuitively, this is the exact same thing. If we think in the way Fodor says, we should be thinking in both these cases of, oh, small sample size is relevant. And yet, we're really good at the coin one, and we're really bad at this one. Just about nobody's first impulse is to say, well, there's not many people in those counties. All right, let's go with the other 2. The other 2, what's more likely that you pull out, if this was the marbles one, if you've got 1 marble in there, it's red, and you've got 999 white marbles, then you pull out 1 marble, you feel that it's wooden. The 1 red marble is wooden, but also 333 of the white marbles are wooden. What's more likely to be in your hand? A white marble or a red? 90% of you got it right. The answer is white marble. Why? Why is the white marble more likely? Yeah, 333 to 1 odds. The odds are just mathematically, there's way more white marbles in the little jar. Therefore, because there's so many more white marbles in the jar, it's far more likely that you're going to pull out a white marble. So 90% of you got this question right. However, only 45% of you, half as many, got the next question right. The next question is on one day you're on a train, there's someone named George. George keeps quoting philosophers. What's the correct answer here? Is it more likely that George is a cop or an Ivy League philosophy professor? What's the correct answer? For those 45% of you who said cop, you were correct. Why is cop more likely?
More cops.
Yeah, simple as that. There's way more cops in the world. There are so many cops out there compared to Ivy League philosophy professors. There's, I don't know, each Ivy League department has maybe 12 professors in their philosophy department. So that's like maximum of 120 people. I probably see more cops on a daily basis than that. So therefore, if you just run into someone in the world, it's far more likely that they're going to be a cop. Therefore, it's far more likely, even if it's just like say 0.1% of cops fall into this category and 50% of philosophy professors do, it's still that you're going to have way more cops reading philosophy out there in the world for you to run into on a train than you are going to have philosophy professors on a train. Like, you're just far more likely to run into them. So intuitively, or like structurally, these 2 questions are identical. The marbles question and the professor's question versus cops question are identical questions. In both cases, I'm asking you, what's more likely? A small group that a high percentage are a certain way, or a large group in which a low percentage are a certain way? Structurally the same. And yet you were able, in the one case, 90% of you to get it right. In the other case, only 45. And if I wasn't asking these in a context of a class, when people are actually given these questions, it's an even higher percentage, something like 80% of people get it wrong. Now, what's more likely for a couple's first child to be a girl or an albino girl? What's the correct answer here? 95% of you got it right. What's more likely, to have a girl or to have an albino girl?
Girl.
A girl, yeah. Why? What's the simple reason? Well, here's the way of drawing it. Here's all the girls that are born each year. Here's all the boys that are drawn each year, or born each year. Here's all the intersex that are born each year. Here's all the albino girls. If you are born an albino girl, you are by definition also a girl. So if you wanted to guess, oh, it's blurry again. Woo! Did it work? No. Yes, there we go. Now, as soon as my shirt starts getting funny. So the idea is that the albino girl is by definition a girl. So you always are good. The goal is, if you're trying to guess correctly, you guess the larger group that contains the smaller group. 95% of you got that right. However, in this case, only 55% of you got it right. Why is it better to guess African American as opposed to African American who's voting for Biden? Well, it's the exact same thing. Here's all the people who are, let's do this. Here's all the African Americans. Here's all the non-African Americans. Here's all the African Americans who are voting for Biden. Let's just draw it. These aren't going to be accurate portrayals. So let's just say it looks like this. This is the Biden group. This is the Trump group. And this is the not voting group. So again, if you guess that somebody's an African American on this description, you're getting all the Biden voters, but you're also getting every other African American. It's a larger group. It's just more likely that someone's going to be a member of a bigger set than a smaller set. So again, our minds got the albino girl versus girl question perfectly, more or less, everybody gets it right. However, in this case, it's much harder, and very often as many as 90% of people get it wrong. So why am I bringing all of this up? These facts are a problem for Fodor and the language of thought. Why are these thoughts a problem for Fodor and the language of thought? Don't if we operate off the same. Yeah, so what's the differentiation from those who have the logical intuition to do these problems correctly compared to those who don't if we operate off the same logical framework? So Alan just put into great words, if you want to look at the chat, he just in a question brought up the core of the problem for Fodor. The problem for Fodor is if our mind operates in this sort of, and Ray, yes, this is heuristics, and I'm going to explain that in 1 second. But if you are Fodor and you say the nature of thought is logical rules, and every bit of thinking is just transitioning from one sentence into another sentence, then any sentences that have the same logical structure should be just as easy for us. They should be just as possible for us to think. However, what these examples show is that we are not in any way the logical creatures all the time that we would seem to be if we always thought in terms of a language of thought. If we actually do think in this language of thought way, then we shouldn't fall prey to all these mistakes. And yet we do. If we thought in the way Fodor says, logic and critical thinking classes should be really, really easy. And yet they aren't. And why not? So here's two answers to this. Is everyone, just to pause for a sec, does everyone understand the structure of what these little examples were designed to show? According to Fodor, all thinking is logical. However, what I just showed is not all thinking is logical. Sometimes we're really good at logic. Sometimes we're not really good at logic. Somebody who comes along and says, hey, Fodor, explain this to me. Explain to me why we're only sometimes good at logic if you say our thought is at its very nature logical. Why on earth are we not logical sometimes? And so at this point, there's three ways you can go. One, you say Fodor is wrong totally. Fodor is totally wrong. We don't think in terms of logic of thought, or language of thought. We don't actually follow logic. Option two, Fodor is right, but it's more complex. And then option 3 is Fodor is half right. So what do I mean by this? So at this point, basically the way you can think of this is we have this data which seems to show that sometimes we think in a way that is not like the language of thought. Sometimes we think in a way that is incredibly not logical. And so option 1, you just say Fodor's totally wrong. Let's go back, no language of thought. What's the problem with taking root 1 though? What is an issue that you might have with taking root 1?
Then you no longer see things in individual pieces. Then you're just back to square one, the issues that Fodor showed before.
Exactly. If you throw out Fodor entirely, you're back to square one and we lose all the things he does explain. Also, if you throw out Fodor, you can't explain those cases that we're very good at. The fact is that 90% of you were able to know that it's more likely to have a girl, 95% of you, and the person who got it wrong may have misclicked or misread, know that it's more likely to have a girl than an albino girl. If you get rid of Fodor, you can't explain why we're so good at this so easily. Logically, if something is A and something is A and B, then anyone who's this one is also going to be that one. And so you knew that albino girl is less likely than girl. However, if you throw out Fodor, that's gone. So it looks like option 1 is not appealing because you're back to square one, you lose the explanatory power. So very few people want to say that Fodor's totally wrong. However, at this point, there comes up a question. And so there's 2 answers to this. One is you just put down your feet and you say, Fodor's right. It's just thinking is more complicated than we think. And in next week, I think, we'll be talking more about this approach. But there's this other approach. And this other approach is to say Fodor's half right. And what do I mean by saying Fodor's half right? Well, what this approach is to say the mind is not simple. There's not just one sort of system in the mind. Rather, the mind really is like a computer that can run multiple programs at the same time. And these programs are operating in different ways and at different speeds. And so what this is supposed to do is show that in the background, we have multiple systems in our mind. We're not just processing information in one way. We have, in fact, 2 main systems. This is called dual process or dual system theory. And what dual process / dual system theory says is Fodor's right for some types of thinking. But the fact is, if you actually want to understand how the mind works, it's running multiple things. One of them is this very logical, structured sort of thought. And the other one is a system which is running on, to use Ray's word, heuristics. It's another system that's structured in a different way that is designed to, it just operates on a different scale and in a different way. And what these examples show is that in these cases, these systems operate in opposite directions because they're designed to do different things. One of them is designed to solve questions quickly and as using not many resources. On the other side, we've got a slower system. System 1 is this fast-paced automatic system. And so what we did in some of these complex questions is our system 1 took the lead and just gave us the quick question. But when we take our time and slow down, system 2 takes over, and that's when we get the Fodor sort of thing. So you keep half of Fodor, but you say there's this other side as well. And so we're out of time, so let me just highlight how this is going to go. Basically, what I want to talk about is for next week, what we're going to do is we're not going to have anything for next Thursday. So what we're going to do is this Thursday lecture is just going to be a little spiel on associationism. I'm going to be assuming it for next week. So please watch it if you get the chance. I'm going to try to keep it short. It's just going to be a background lecture on associationism and what that is. Next Tuesday, I'm going to talk more about dual system. And then probably we're going to push back it's all Fodor to the week after. So I will email you that stuff. But just for the Thursday lecture, it's just going to be a background lecture. But background here is if you have to go right now, feel free to leave. I'm just going to kind of put a little bow on this. And I want to respond to these questions from Alan and Eddie. So Alan says, I think the problem for me, there was more information in the second one, and I wasn't looking at the information that draws the correct conclusion. So I believe the logic is still there and Fodor's still correct. So what that response Alan just gave is this second response. This is to say Fodor is fundamentally correct. It's just that we are not taking into account the fact that the mind is finite and that we can have conflicting beliefs with ourselves, or that we have limited resources. And so if we aren't paying close attention, our computerized logic programs don't run perfectly well. And so what we're going to look at in a couple of weeks is somebody who says essentially Fodor is right. This other associative system doesn't exist. It is all this, and the examples that people who motivate dual process theory point to are misdescribed. Really, it's just that Fodor's a good starting point, but we need to supplement it to understand what's going on. So, Eddie, would this be a mixing of materialism and folk psychology in terms of language? So a way to think of it instead is, this will make a little more sense in terms of, I'm not sure if it's materialism that's getting mixed, but I think one way to think of it is, remember last time, or sorry, at the start of class, I was talking about sometimes our thoughts are combined of parts, and other times it's just transition from one whole to another whole. I think it's more what the dual process people are going to say is that the mind is actually structured so that sometimes it really is this sort of just straight up whole thing to whole thing. While in other cases, it's more the logical structured one. So it's not really the eliminativist, because these people are still going to say it's a matter of contents in the mind. And so dual process theory still thinks that it's all mental and we're not getting rid of the mental terms, but rather it's that Fodor's idea of it being parts of our thoughts and things like that are only true some of the time. And if we actually want to explain these weird behaviors, we also have to take into account the fact that we think in this other dumber way that has more in common with our animal ancestors. All right, so that's all I wanted to say for today. I will email you all this afternoon about what the next couple classes are going to be like. Basically, we're taking more time to do everything than I initially planned, which is great. It means we're going in more depth. But it does, and I mean, it's great for you too, because there's less reading to do or to fail to do. So I will see you all on Tuesday. Again, I'm going to post a lecture to the YouTube about associationism and what that means. So please watch that as best you can. And again, if you want a paper draft read over, I will be reading them so long as I get them before Monday. And then the final paper is due next Thursday. All right, I will see everyone next week.
Thanks, Professor.
Have a good one.